The Committee on Homeland Security Subcommittee on Oversight, Investigations, and Accountability will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to understand the scope and scale of the Department of Homeland Security's and CISA's counter, mis, dis, and malinformation efforts, and why government censorship continues to present a threat to the free discourse essential to a constitutional republic. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good afternoon, and welcome to this hearing of the subcommittee titled Censorship Laundering Part 2, Preventing the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Silencing of Dissent. In May, this subcommittee held our first hearing to examine the Department of Homeland Security's role as the nerve center for the federal government's scheme to censor the online voices of millions of Americans. What we learned during that hearing was deeply concerning. As Americans, we are committed to the idea that freedom of speech and open debate are essential features of a free society. Make no mistake, the efforts to censor public discourse under the guise of so-called mis, dis, and malinformation, MDM, threaten this essential freedom and the very core of our republic. Now, through our own investigation and the incredible work of a small group of individuals dedicated to protecting Americans' fundamental rights to discourse and debate, including our witnesses today, we have a far more complete picture of the censorship laundering complex and how it operates. While we recognize the cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency's mission of protecting our institutions from legitimate cybersecurity threats, we cannot allow a component of the Department of Homeland Security to anchor a censorship laundering enterprise. Silencing the voices of the American people is never acceptable by government, and we must return the agency to its core mission. Two major developments have been enormously helpful to our investigations into the true extent of DHS and CISA's role in government censorship efforts. First, several lawsuits, most notably Missouri versus Biden, although the Assistant Attorney General for the Division of Civil Rights doesn't know about that litigation. I hope she'll take note of it. That lawsuit has made public vital evidence uncovering the scope and scale of government efforts to censor online speech. Second, Elon Musk released the second edition of the Twitter files, exposing the breadth of the government's efforts to censor American speech online. In addition, we have learned that despite the federal government's continued denials of having any role in the creation of the so-called Election Integrity Project, EIP, that DHS and CISA were involved from the beginning. Look at the words of Graham Brookie, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, DFR Lab, one of the four founding EIP partners, who wrote this to his colleagues on July 21, 2020, quote, "We just set up an election integrity partnership at the request of DHS/CISA and are in weekly comms to debrief about disinformation, disinfo, IO, etc., end quote. As an active participant with EIP partners, CISA was, quote, switchboarding, end quote, which is the term CISA used to describe flagging what they called misinformation and notifying social media platforms who could, quote, independently, unquote, decide whether to remove or modify the content. CISA Director Jen Easterly claimed earlier this year during a DHS Appropriations Subcommittee hearing that we don't flag anything to social media organizations, unquote, but that is exactly what CISA was doing. Moreover, while EIP and its stakeholders claim the EIP was just conducting research, that's the terminology, conducting research, the words of a senior EIP official during a transcribed interview with our committee say otherwise. Quote, flagging content for social media companies was part and parcel with the EIP's creation, end quote. There is, unfortunately, far more evidence than I have time to describe. After CISA's hands were caught in the censorship cookie jar, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have come to the defense of its censorship laundering enterprise, its censorship by proxy. They claim that there were no funding links between CISA and these outside organizations, no censorship. At the same time, they take pains to reaffirm their commitment to fighting, quote, misinformation, close quote. Just last week, the ranking member of the full committee issued a press release denying that CISA created, funded, or directed the work of the Election Integrity Partnership. Now, you can believe the press release, or you can believe the individuals in the private sector who were most intimately involved with this work, who talk about how the government gave them the ability to stomp out misinformation. Listen, for example, to Alex Stamos.
A lack of capability around election disinformation. This is not because CISA didn't care about disinformation, but at the time, they lacked both kind of the funding and the legal authorizations to go do the kinds of work that would be necessary to truly understand how election disinformation was operating. So because of the feedback and the ideas from this group, we were able to pull together pretty quickly a project between these 4 different institutions to try to fill the gap of the things that the government could not do themselves.
As a reminder, the impact of this censorship effort was massive. 859 million tweets collected for, quote, misinformation analysis. 22 million tweets and retweets categorized as misinformation, subject to censorship. 21 Twitter users, Americans, identified and stigmatized as, quote, the most prominent repeat spreaders of disinformation, close quote, every one of whom were on the political right. And it was not just for elections. The same network used the same tools to censor dozens of purportedly false COVID-19 narratives, of which some were later proved true, but all of which were within the sphere of free speech that the Constitution protects from government interference. Let's turn to where things might be headed. We know that DHS and CISA have continued to explore ways to build on their counter-MDM efforts. Some of their publicly acknowledged or directed efforts have been pretty Orwellian, like DHS's ill-conceived effort to establish a disinformation governance board last year, or CISA Director Jen Easterly's bizarre comment about controlling citizens' thoughts through regulating, quote, cognitive infrastructure, end quote, as critical infrastructure reposed to CISA's care. Other evidence is more bureaucratic, but no less alarming. Look, for example, at CISA's Cybersecurity Advisory Committee's MDM Subcommittee, which continues to exist, and to recommend that CISA should expand efforts into new areas, such as the courts, financial systems, and public health. The MDM Subcommittee also recommended CISA view its counter-MDM work across a much wider range of media. Other DHS documents suggest CISA wants also to broaden the target issues of public concern to include racial justice, immigration, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and support to Ukraine. What is stopping DHS from overreaching its jurisdiction beyond elections to censor more Americans, to, quote, protect whatever government-deployed orthodox notions it deems critical infrastructure? Right now, the answer is nothing. While CISA has made a public pretense of pulling back from some of its more aggressive censorship efforts, that change was driven by public scrutiny and not, from all that appears, to a fundamental change of heart. This is unacceptable and dangerous. Every American, even those serving in the vast federal bureaucracy, should be committed to upholding Americans' fundamental rights. At this point, it appears the courts may provide part of the solution. Indeed, the District of Louisiana and the Fifth Circuit subsequently, the Fifth Circuit in particular, ruled in an affirmance this October that CISA probably violated the First Amendment through its censorship activities. This is to be now decided by the United States Supreme Court. But the issue of DHS and CISA's censorship efforts goes beyond a ruling on the precise contours of the First Amendment. The government's power to censor speech, including online speech, must be strictly limited to content that is not constitutionally protected, such as inciting imminent lawless action. At DHS, censorship became ordinary and banal, an everyday activity carried out by anonymous and unaccountable bureaucrats using censorship by proxy to accomplish indirectly and in secret what it would not have the power to do openly. Congress cannot wait or hope for a court decision to stop DHS and CISA's overreach. Congress has a duty to rein in out-of-control agencies and protect the rights of the American people. To that end, this subcommittee will be drafting legislation that stops DHS and CISA's censorious MDM efforts and prevent DHS and CISA from working with social media platforms to suppress free speech online. The government cannot simply sidestep the Constitution by outsourcing censorship under the guise of protecting critical infrastructure. Thank you all for joining, and I look forward to hearing testimony from our witnesses. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ivey, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to say I have a slightly different take on this than my friend from North Carolina in a variety of ways. I think that the claims about CISA being a giant censorship entity completely misses the mark based on the transcripts that I've seen of testimony that's been given by this committee and to this committee and other committees here in the House. For example, this is a statement from Brandon Wales. He's the CISA Executive Director. CISA does not and has never censored speech or facilitated censorship. Any such claims are patently false. We can go through a few of these others, and we will, including the testimony that I had mentioned a moment ago. For example, Mr. Masterson. Now, Masterson was an interesting individual who came up through the Republican Party in the Ohio State election boards. He now works for Microsoft, but he made a couple of statements with respect to this issue. One, they were never compelled. They never compelled the platforms to take positions or take down information. In other words, they never forced censorship to happen of any kind. No, I don't recall that happening in my experience, no. And there's a couple other quotes from him that I'd like to share on this front too. Do you have any, at any point in your experience working at CISA, were you advised that you had the authority to compel a social media company to take any particular action related to any particular content on social media? No, I don't recall that happening in my experience, no. Do you have that? Did you ever try to exercise that authority? No, I don't recall ever perceiving that I had that authority. Mr. Stamos, who was just mentioned a moment ago, also has testified here in the House. To be clear, at no time did the EIP censor speech or have access to back-end platform systems or data outside of public content. The EIP did not take down posts or apply labels and had no power to do so. The EIP did not create targeting lists or blacklists of accounts, and the list of accounts included in our reports as the top spreaders of false information were generated by our own analysis, which importantly occurred after the election. Mr. Stamos was the person who the tape was played a moment ago by the chairman. We've got more of those, but I need to move forward because I think on a couple of fronts here, we have to address the reality of what's going on, I think, behind some of this. There are a lot of conspiracy theories that persist that are, in my view, dangerously weakening America's ability to defend itself against foreign attacks from Russia, China, and Iran. Some of these attacks focus on Americans' election and our election apparatus, especially since we haven't fully responded to in the wake of the 2016 and 20 attacks with respect to those elections. In 2017, the Trump administration's national security strategy included a section on information statecraft, naming Russia and China among the adversaries seeking to, quote, weaponize information, close quote, for strategic gain and control. Adversaries of the United States leverage influence operations and disinformation campaigns to degrade confidence in key institutions, sow civil discord, and undermine U.S. pillars of power. For example, Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, I think is a powerful example. I know there's been a lot of political debate about, collusion and other issues, but the Senate Intelligence Committee found that Putin ordered the Russian effort to hack Democratic Party networks and accounts to leak information damaging to Hillary Clinton. There's also information with respect to Iranians trying to do the same thing on the opposite side, posing as Proud Boys to intimidate voters in the 2020 election. That's based on an indictment. The Department of Justice is prosecuting individuals involved in that case. But that's on the other side of this. From my perspective, this isn't a partisan issue. That was an attempt apparently to, in their view, help the Biden campaign. But I also think we have to focus on this because we face internal dangers that can come from the internet and some of the information that's being abused on that front. The January 6th attack against the Capitol was aimed at preventing the lawful and peaceful transfer of power. The internet was used, the social media platforms were used essentially as the principal means of communications for many of those activities. And also some of the, in my view, false conspiracy theories that have grown out of that, like the ghost buses issue that was raised here in this committee a few weeks ago, I think is disinformation that we need to address. The recent Osama bin Laden letter, which got viral on the internet and ended up, I think it had over 2 million views, but essentially was espousing the bin Laden's view that the United States is an evil country, that 9/11 was an appropriate attack on the United States, and I'm concerned about the impact it could have, for example, on lone wolf individuals in the United States. And there are other kind of efforts like that that are aimed at reaching out directly to people in the United States to encourage them to engage in terrorist activities. This is an article from the Washington Post, How Osama bin Laden's Letter to America Reached Millions Online. Videos citing the document had been viewed far less than many TikTok posts. Then a journalist made a compilation and posted it on X, causing attention to the manifesto to explode. That was dated November 16, 2023, and I offer it for the record.
Ordered to be submitted.
I think it's important for CISA to continue to not only exist, but continue to operate at full capacity. I know there have been some efforts to reduce its capabilities, but the 2018 and 2020 cycles, the censorship issue, CISA connected election stakeholders to social media platforms in a nonpartisan manner by forwarding election disinformation reporting from election officials of both parties to the relevant platforms. I believe we've got an email here from the RNC that was sent to CISA. This is, again, in an effort to be bipartisan on this front, the RNC detected misinformation that was being circulated in Philadelphia during that campaign cycle that election workers were going to be paid, and that was incorrect. It worked its way up the chain. I didn't put all of the emails on this board here, but at the end of it, they sent it to CISA seeking help into taking down the information so the disinformation wouldn't spread. I don't know if that kind of funding is illegal in Pennsylvania, but I think the main point is that the RNC, at least in that election cycle, didn't view this as some sort of censorship effort. This was just an effort to make sure that they got correct information out to the public. And that's true in other scenarios too. One of the issues that we've seen pop up, false information with respect to elections. If the election's going to happen on Wednesday instead of Tuesday, the government needs to be able to correct that kind of misinformation. Also, there's a point I wanted to make too about this. I think the argument seems to be that CISA was essentially compelling people, these platforms, to remove or edit information that was available on that platform. But all of the emails that we've seen had a disclaimer that was displayed on the screen. Up here, okay. This is attached, and you can see down at the bottom of it there, basically it says, quote, CISA affirms that it neither has nor seeks the ability to remove or edit what information is made available on social media platforms. CISA makes no recommendation about how the information it is sharing should be handled or used by social media companies. Thank you. Social media platforms make their own decisions regarding the content on their platforms, and each have their own rules regarding the labeling and removal of mis- and disinformation. Of the posts flagged by the EIP, platforms took action on 35%, 21% were labeled, 13% were removed, 1% were soft blocked. No action was taken on 65% of those. This is not government censorship or censorship by proxy. Social media companies are privately owned and make content decisions based on their terms of service. I also want to raise this issue with respect to the elections that are coming up. State and local officials in these elections are seeking the assistance of not only the federal government, but of each other, because a lot of these challenges that arise have nationwide impact and affect their different states, even if the misinformation or false information arises somewhere else. So state and local officials from 21 different states requested CISA's assistance leading up to the 2020 election, including Republican officials, to address foreign influence operations and disinformation. Kentucky state officials flagged tweets that falsely indicated Democratic votes were being undercounted in favor of Republican votes during a contentious Senate race. A county in Florida, for the supervisor of elections, shared threats emailed to Democratic voters. The Donald Trump campaign and the RNC flagged the misinformation about an RNC volunteer stipend program. We showed that already. According to an April 2023 survey, 85% of local election officials responded that it is beneficial, quote, for CISA to dispel false information about elections by promoting accurate information on election administration and technology, close quote. I will wind this up. I do want to get to the testimony of both panels, but I did want to raise these points about the Missouri v. Biden case. I think it's important to note that the Fifth Circuit put a stay on the rulings that the district court had issued, particularly with respect to the limitations on the government from having interactions with social media platforms. I guess the district court had imposed essentially a total restriction on it. The Fifth Circuit rolled that back, and I think it's fair. I've read some versions of this, and I've read the opinion myself that some of the opinions, the district court's opinions, information is based on false information or misinformation as well. So I'm hoping that as this case works its way through the courts, and I wouldn't be shocked if the Supreme Court remanded it for additional findings of fact, that a lot of this will be addressed. But the main point I want to make before I wrap up is that I'm concerned that there's been a chilling effect with respect to CISA, the social media platforms, people who are doing research. They're concerned about if they raise their head up, they get in trouble, they get subpoenas, they get doxxed. And we've got a couple of statements with respect to that. But I think it's important for us to make sure that we want to make sure there's no censorship going on. I think that my colleagues on the other side have significantly overstated that based on the transcripts I've seen. But importantly, I think we have to keep in mind that not only do we have to worry about making sure we have the apparatus in place, for example, to deal with child sexual exploitation and terrorism online, but also that we're able to address election issues, other types of foreign attacks that might be encouraging people to engage in terrorism or the like. We have to make sure that we have that capability up and ready to go, that people feel that they can do the work and reach their own conclusions. We might disagree about those conclusions, whether a particular social media platform takes information down or not. I don't know there's going to be universal agreement on all of that, but I think we need to make sure that people feel they can operate in a safe environment, and that includes exercising their First Amendment rights. So, Mr. Chairman, we may draw the line in different places, clearly we do, but I think our ultimate goal is the same. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Ivey. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. I'm pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this very important topic. I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. I would now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Mr. Michael Schellenberger is an investigative journalist and founder of Public. Mr. Mark Chenoweth is the president and general counsel of New Civil Liberties Alliance. Mr. Alex Abdo is the litigation director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Mr. Gary Lowkowski is a senior fellow at the Council to Modernize Governance. I thank you all for being here today. The chair will now recognize each witness for oral statements. Each oral statement will be limited to 5 minutes, but submitted written statements by witnesses will appear in the hearing record in their entirety. I now recognize Mr. Schellenberger for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivey, and members of the subcommittee for inviting my testimony. Researchers asked by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to flag election and COVID misinformation to social media platforms in 2020 and 2021 say that they didn't break the law. According to the leaders of the Stanford Internet Observatory and the other groups involved, they simply alerted social media platforms to potential violations of their terms of service. What the platforms chose to do after that was up to them. But during the 2 years the DHS-empowered researchers were asking social media platforms to take down, throttle, or otherwise censor social media posts, the President of the United States was accusing big tech of killing people. His then press secretary said publicly that the administration was, quote, flagging violative posts for Facebook. Members of Congress threatened to strip social media platforms of their legal right to operate because they said the platforms weren't censoring enough. And many supposedly disinterested researchers were aggressively demanding that the platforms change their terms of service. It's true that the social media platforms are private companies, technically free to censor content as they see fit, and are under no clearly stated obligation to obey demands by the U.S. government or its authorized researchers at Stanford or elsewhere. But the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution states clearly that the government should take no action that would limit free speech, and the record shows that the U.S. government in general, and DHS in particular, did just that. DHS supported, created, and participated in the 2020 Cyber Threat Intelligence League, the 2020 Election Integrity Partnership, or EIP, and the 2021 Virality Project, or VP. In the case of the EIP and VP, 4 think tanks led by Stanford Internet Observatory and reporting to CISA demanded and achieved mass censorship of the American people in direct violation of the First Amendment. A longtime U.S. Navy officer and UK military contractor created this so-called anti-disinformation wing of the CTIL, Cyber Threat Intelligence League, in 2020. In doing so, they pioneered the misdescription of censorship laundering as cybersecurity. They used CTIL as a front group to demand censorship and demanded that cognitive security be viewed as their responsibility in addition to physical security and cybersecurity. DHS publicly blessed this project, and its staff helped create CTIL's anti-disinformation efforts and participated actively in its internal Slack messaging program. The explanations and justifications by the creators and leaders of the EIP and VP have shifted over the last 9 months. At first, an SIO executive, Renee DiResta, claimed in a video for DHS that the idea for EIP came from SIO's interns, who happened to be working at DHS at the time. More recently, another SIO executive, Alex Stamos, claimed that the idea was his. Then, last month, this committee released documents establishing that DHS-authorized groups believed that the idea had come from DHS. Quote, we just set up an election integrity partnership at the request of DHS CISA, said Atlantic Council Senior Executive Graham Brookie. After Matt Taibbi and I testified before Congress in March, a Stanford Internet Observatory spokesperson said, quote, "It did not censor or ask social media platforms to remove any social media content regarding coronavirus vaccine side effects." That turned out not to be true, as internal messages from its operation released publicly by the committee last month proved. Consider the language that was used. Hi, Facebook, Reddit, and Twitter, we recommend it be removed from your platforms. We repeat our recommendation that this account be suspended. We recommend labeling. We recommend that you flag as false or remove the post below. Under the guise of a research project, EIP was enmeshed with the federal government leading up to the 2020 election. 4 students involved in EIP were even employed by CISA. One Stanford student, for example, worked as a DHS intern inside the EIP network. These internal emails show that CISA and its nonprofit partners reported political speech to social media platforms, including jokes, hyperbole, and the types of viewpoints and non-specific statements that CIS once claimed it would not censor. In 2020, Department of Homeland Security officials and personnel from EIP were often on emails together, and CISA's personnel had access to EIP's tickets through an internal messaging system known as JIRA. Anyone who doubts that DHS authorized organizations, SIO chief among them, need only look at the internal workflow graphic in a VIP proposal obtained earlier this week through a FOIA request by my colleague Matt Taibbi. It shows how disinformation, quote, incidents are routed to platform partners for takedowns. Everybody understood exactly what was going on. These were demands for censorship. And I should just add here that I absolutely support counter speech. I agree that if there's false information out there about elections, the point is to respond publicly to it. That's not what was happening here. They were demanding that information be censored, and it wasn't just around the date of the election or the security of mail-in ballots. It was on a whole range of social and political issues which the Supreme Court has historically protected more than any other form of speech. I would just close by saying, if you set aside for a moment the Orwellian aspects of CISA's efforts at mind control, what do we think the consequences could be of CISA taking its eye off the cybersecurity ball so it can crusade with Stanford interns against wrongthink? Should we be able to sleep soundly at night knowing that CISA is focused on the problem of people being wrong on the internet rather than on China, Russia, Iran, and other malicious actors seeking to harm American businesses, government agencies, and our citizens? What's at stake here is our fundamental freedom to express our views on controversial social and political issues without fear of government censorship. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Schellenberger. I now recognize Mr. Chenoweth for his 5 minutes for his opening statements.
Good afternoon, Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivey, members and guests. My name is Mark Chenoweth, and I'm the president of the New Civil Liberties Alliance, a nonpartisan, nonprofit civil rights group founded by Professor Philip Hamburger of Columbia Law School to fight unlawful administrative power. NCLA fills the void left by legacy civil liberties groups that no longer care about government-directed censorship. NCLA's motto is, let judges judge, let legislators legislate, and don't let bureaucrats do either. We champion the people's right to be governed by representatives they pick and Congress's job to write the laws. Congress never authorized the administrative state censorship we are discussing today. My written testimony explains NCLA's public interest litigation combating social media censorship on behalf of 4 individuals in the Murthy v. Missouri Supreme Court case. But I'm here today to sound the alarm on 4 legal principles Congress must uphold to stop the rampant censorship by DHS, CISA, and multiple other federal agencies. First, the government is not the arbiter of truth. As Justice Robert Jackson observed, the very purpose of the First Amendment is to foreclose public authority from assuming a guardianship of the public mind. Every person must be his own watchman for truth because the forefathers did not trust any government to separate true from the false. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the government proved unable to uphold truth. It peddled falsehoods that natural immunity does not exist to COVID-19, that vaccine immunity is superior to natural immunity, and that vaccines would stop the transmission of the virus. The government then suppressed dissenting voices on Twitter, Facebook, and elsewhere who dared to express rational, scientifically accurate views on COVID-19 and the vaccines. Second, the First Amendment protects even false speech. Much of the suppressed COVID speech was true, but in U.S. v. Alvarez, the Supreme Court held false statements as a general rule are not beyond constitutional protection. Were the court to hold that the interest in truthful discourse alone is sufficient to sustain a ban on speech, it would give government a broad censorial power unprecedented in this court's cases or in our constitutional tradition, end quote. This means labeling disfavored speech as misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation does not strip it of First Amendment protection. Third, The government may not do indirectly what the First Amendment forbids it from doing directly. It is axiomatic, according to the Supreme Court, Norwood v. Harrison, 1973, that the government may not induce, encourage, or promote private persons to accomplish what it is constitutionally forbidden to accomplish. The bully pulpit does not include the power to harangue social media platforms to remove the lawful speech of third parties. When the government coerces or pressures a company with threats, and the company responds by censoring private individuals, that is unlawful state action. But if the government writes and tests software to effectively monitor and shut down disfavored speech, and then turns that over to private actors to run the software that censors the speech, that is also forbidden state action. It doesn't matter that it's indirect. The First Amendment bar is much lower. Fourth, the First Amendment term abridging supplies the test to determine when the government has violated the right to free speech. The only question for the courts is whether the government's conduct has led to the abridging, that is, the diminishing of speech. The test is not coercion. It is not whether something was compelled. It's not pressure. It's not entanglement. It's abridging. The First Amendment prohibits government from abridging speech, which contrasts with the narrower term prohibiting in the Free Exercise Clause, as my written testimony citing Professor Hamburger explains. I will close with 3 examples that illustrate the scope of the problem with government-led censorship through CISA switchboarding and other practices. First, the Virality Project flagged Harvard Med School epidemiologist Martin Koldorf's tweet, which stated, quote, "Thinking that everyone must be vaccinated is as scientifically flawed as thinking that nobody should. COVID vaccines are important for older, high-risk people and their caretakers. Those with prior natural infection do not need it, nor children," unquote. This tweet was censored and his account flagged. Second, the Virality Project wrote a report in which another NCLA client, Bree Dressen, was identified as a purveyor of misinformation for discussing the adverse, devastating effects she personally suffered from the AstraZeneca vaccine after she volunteered for a vaccine trial, even though NIH itself had diagnosed her as vaccine injured. In NCLA's Dressen v. Flaherty case, we are suing the government for shutting down Bree's support groups for vaccine-injured individuals. These are private online groups where vaccine-injured people can turn for emotional support. When their support groups were deleted, group members failed to get assistance they could have gotten that would have led to better treatments for them. At least one committed suicide. This is private speech we're talking about among already vaccinated people who want to converse with each other and share their stories. They will not promote vaccine hesitancy to the general public because the speech occurs in private forums, and yet the government is still suppressing that speech as we sit here. This is insanity. Third, White House pressure led the lab leak theory to be censored on social media. When Meta head of Global Affairs, Nick Clegg, asked a colleague why the story had been censored on Facebook, the colleague replied, quote, "Because we were under pressure from the administration and others to do more," unquote, and that, quote, "we shouldn't have done it," unquote. Meta also acknowledged changing its policies regarding content discussing adverse vaccine events to avoid retaliation from this White House. In sum, these responses to dissenting COVID-19 views show the dangers of government censorship. The government's conduct violated censored Americans' First Amendment rights, as well as the rights of other Americans to listen and learn from those perspectives and to draw their own conclusions about their health, their vote, and the truth. This committee must force the executive branch to correct course before it completely obliterates the First Amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chenoweth. I now recognize Mr. Abdo for his 5 minutes.
Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivey, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Alex Abdo, and I'm the litigation director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. The topic that this subcommittee has been exploring on the relationship between government and social media platforms is an important one, in large part because it implicates many competing First Amendment interests. I'd like to offer several observations to clarify the constitutional principles that should guide this subcommittee's work. First, as the Supreme Court held 60 years ago in Bantam Books versus Sullivan, the First Amendment forbids the government from coercing private actors into silencing disfavored speech. That decision was correct because coercion, by definition, overrides the ability of people to decide for themselves what to say, what to listen to, and what communities to join. This rule is important not only in protecting individuals, but also in protecting the social media platforms, which now play a vital role in hosting and curating the speech of millions of people. The communities they create reflect their own expressive decisions, as well as the expressive and associational preferences of their users. Outside of very narrow exceptions, it would be inconsistent with the principle of self-government to allow officials to dictate the speech individuals may create and consume in these online communities, whether directly through official sanction or indirectly through official coercion. Second, While the First Amendment forbids the government from coercing private actors into suppressing speech, it does not preclude the government from trying to persuade private actors to embrace its views. A democratically elected government must have the power to govern, and an indispensable tool in governing is attempting to galvanize public opinion. As the Supreme Court reaffirmed just a few years ago, governing necessarily involves taking a particular viewpoint and rejecting others. It is not easy to imagine, the court wrote, how government could function if it could not express its views. The public also has a strong interest in hearing what its government has to say. Hearing the government's views helps ordinary citizens evaluate the government's decisions and hold government officials accountable for them. In addition, private actors often rely on the government's expertise in making decisions about their own speech. In the years after 9/11, for example, news organizations welcomed the input of the government in deciding whether to publish classified information that had been leaked to them. This is not to say, of course, that anyone should defer to the government's views, knowledge, or expertise. The government often gets things wrong. But a rule requiring the government to stand silent on matters of public policy would be paralyzing, as the Supreme Court has said. Third, and this is a point I really want to emphasize today, the First Amendment protects the right of researchers to study social media platforms and to share their findings with the public, the platforms, and the government. It should not need to be said that when researchers study the social media platforms, they are exercising rights protected by the First Amendment. When they criticize the platform's content moderation policies and practices, the First Amendment protects them. When they press the platforms to take down speech, the First Amendment protects them. And yes, even when you and I disagree with their research findings and proposals, the First Amendment protects them. For these reasons, I think it's crucial for the subcommittee to tread carefully in this area. It's legitimate to investigate the executive branch to see whether it has coerced or conspired with researchers to suppress protected speech. But investigations of and lawsuits against private researchers who acted independently of the government are not a defense of the First Amendment. They are a grave threat to it. Finally, let me conclude by acknowledging what I hope is a common concern. The concentration of private power over public discourse is a threat to free speech. The First Amendment does not forbid the social media companies from assuming gatekeeper control over public discourse, nor does it insulate them, however, from careful regulation that would loosen that control. Congress can and should pass legislation that would do just that. It should require the platforms to design their systems to be interoperable so that users can switch to competing services without losing their social networks. It should enact a privacy law that gives users greater control over their personal data, making it easier for users to switch between competing services and harder for platforms to obtain and monopolize access to the data that drives their profitability. And Congress should enact transparency laws that make it easier to study the platforms and the effects they're having on public discourse. Carefully drafted laws of this kind would address some of the legitimate concerns with the platforms consistently with the First Amendment. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Abdo. I now recognize Mr. Lokowski for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the committee, thank you very much for this opportunity to testify today. My name is Gary Lokowski. I'm a senior fellow with the Council to Modernize Governance. I'd like to begin with a little bit of a story. For about the last 2 years or so, I've had the distinct pleasure of dating a lovely woman who lives up in Baltimore, Maryland. Now, I live in Virginia. If you've ever made that drive, that can be a bit of a challenge. Sometimes you're going up and down the GW Parkway, back and forth between Virginia and Baltimore. I've been doing that a lot over the past 2 years, and I gotta tell you, when I'm driving down that road, there are all these crazy people going down there. If it's not someone zipping past me on the right, it's someone plodding along on the left, blocking up traffic. It drives me crazy. There are all these other maniacs out there on the road. Someone really should do something about that. But the problem is, to me, regulating disinformation is a lot like regulating driving. I suspect if you took those other people, sat them in this chair, stood them up, have them raise their right hand and make the same oath to swear to tell the truth, they would also say, hey, it's that crazy guy with those Virginia tags out there. He's the one who doesn't know how to drive, not me. In the words of the sage of our time, Taylor Swift, sometimes maybe though, it's me, hi, I'm the problem, it's me. We all think we're good drivers, but it turns out we may well be the maniac. And that's why we need to approach these issues with a fair degree of humility and recognize that we may not be the ones who know what's true. We may be the one who's wrong. That's why regulating disinformation, misinformation, these other things is so dangerous, because it sort of presumes this position that we're always right and that we can always get the answer right. That's particularly dangerous when it's coming from government. So we've heard some talk already about what are the limits from the First Amendment and kind of how far can we go with that, as though the First Amendment itself is kind of the end-all be-all of this. And while the First Amendment is incredibly important, I think it's even more important to look kind of behind that and why we have a First Amendment. Why do we care about this? Why is this something that's in our Constitution? Why do we prioritize free expression at all? So first and foremost, free expression, including and perhaps especially the expression of ideas that most people think are wrong, people may think that person's a maniac, they're important and they're necessary in the search for truth. Pursuing truth requires correcting errors, and that means standing up against prevailing narratives and standing up against what seem to be consensus. Otherwise, we'd be locked into antiquated ideas. To take just kind of one example, I was a child in the 90s. We had this food pyramid from the Department of Agriculture. That was the end-all, be-all of healthy eating. If you follow this, you'll stay healthy, you'll be in good shape. So, I took that as the settled science. Well, it turns out since that time, it's been updated at least twice by the Department of Agriculture. It's also been called into question by numerous public health schools, such as the Harvard Public Health School. What we thought was true may have been wrong, even about something as elemental as eating, something that people have to do, have been doing as long as there have been people. We may still get that information wrong. This is one reason we need to tread very carefully around the free expression, because it allows us to correct these consensus, purportedly settled ideas when it turns out they may be wrong. A second thing, free expression sort of lowers the temperature and the stakes for political contests. It's one thing if I'm wrong and you're right and I lose, then I can litigate that in the next election, I can litigate that at another opportunity. If I think I'm right and you think you're right, and whoever wins gets to shut the other person up, that's a big problem. That really raises the stakes in our political contests, because now it's no longer about coming back in the next election. Now it's about this is the thing that settles this issue for all time. And that's a huge problem, particularly at a time where there's already concern about political polarization. Third, free expression provides a window into what people believe. Just because we tell people they can't say something doesn't mean they stop believing that. They still do, they just become much more careful or much more discerning about who they're going to express those views to. Thus, bad ideas don't really go away just because you censor them. They just go underground, and that's not healthy for our society. And then fourth, and perhaps most fundamentally, one of the problems with regulating this sort of disinformation gets back to that driving question. It's who decides? And I would say the government is the last person you want making those decisions, because it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Even if they don't say do this or else, there's always that implicit or else in what government's doing. So what do we do about this? How do we go beyond just the four corners of the First Amendment to protect our rights going forward? First, we have to return to first principles. The federal government, particularly the executive branch, should not be the arbiter of truth. Second of all, there should be bright lines protecting and preventing the federal government from interfering with constitutionally protected speech. In very limited circumstances that have been recognized by the court, there may be a place to step in, like child pornography, imminent threats. In other places, though, the government really shouldn't be stepping in to try to tell people what they can and can't say online. Third, domestic-facing agencies, particularly the Department of Homeland Security, really should not be involved in this. This is not to absolve other agencies of responsibility, but it is to say that these agencies' goal and their main target audience is American citizens, and American citizens should not be restricted by their government on what they can and can't say. Fourth, there's a slippery slope in the definitional changes that we've seen, and I believe that will be talked about a little more, about this idea that we've gone from critical infrastructure as physical things to cognitive infrastructure, and the idea that we have to regulate ideas. That should not happen without, at very least, a robust public debate that has not happened. Fifth, the government should cut federal funding for anti-disinformation programs that seek to flag and censor First Amendment projects. It's one thing to say these are private institutions, but it's another thing when they're being funded with our tax dollars. And finally, there must be avenues for personal accountability for people who do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lukowski. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I want to begin. I wonder if, Mr. Ivey, if you would pull back up, your staff might pull back up the enlargement you had, the first one, the statement by a DHS official from November 2023.
Mr. Novak?
I think that's right. Or if you, you have the enlargement. And let me say, as I'm beginning, or asking that to come up, thank you, I'll use it in just a sec, if you hold it for me. First of all, it's interesting how little separates the views expressed on the panel, and I think between me and the ranking member of the subcommittee. And I think therein lies something that's very, that needs to be focused on. There are some red herrings or straw men here that can be knocked down pretty quickly. I agree this is not about partisanship, by the way. I mean, I think there's some evidence that the conservatives were more frequently censored, but that is not at all the point. The problem is that it can affect and will affect both sides at the same time. Here's what troubles me, though. Okay. This is a November 2023 statement by Brandon Wales. He says, CISA does not and has never censored speech or facilitated censorship. Any such claims are patently false. So it would be one thing if this turned out to be an excess or a misjudgment or something that grew up naturally out of the COVID pandemic or something, or the election concern that people say, look, we went too far, we've curtailed that, we no longer do that. But that's not what's being said here. It is a categorical declaration that there has been no censorship. And I got to tell you, that deepens the concern because we are, if the situation were, okay, the Disinformation Governance Board has been abandoned because there was a huge public outcry, we'd realize that CISA or DHS, that was a mistake. That's one thing. But for them to abandon it and for the effort to go subterranean, underground, and be popping up but continue to be pursued, that's a very significant thing, and it certainly justifies the continued examination into this topic. And I would say with my friend from Maryland, the ranking member, this contention that the social media platforms were never compelled, that is the thing that continues to be said. But, and the ranking members read the cases, so have I, from the Fifth Circuit, that make clear the tests that are applied is not that you're lined up against the wall with a gun at your head to say you must take this information down off your social media platform. The question is the degree to which government may be perceived to have been intensively involved, and thereby the censorship by the so-called private entity becomes government action. It's a little bit like the notion, the old saying, you remember, nice little business you got there, it'd be a shame if something were to happen to it. That is a threat, even though it isn't stated in threatening language. Mr. Schellenberger, how about that? We've got CISA taking down the video on that had the fictional character Sharon urged to report as misinformation what her uncle was stating online. They've taken that down. They've done a number of things like that to telegraph that this isn't something we're going to do anymore. I took that to be the thrust of Jen Easterly's testimony in the Appropriations Committee, and yet this is a declaration we've never done it. And there's not even an issue about whether we've done it or something that needs to get ironed out. What about that? Shouldn't we be concerned about that phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. If it were up to me, I think if there's important cybersecurity activities happening in CISA that should continue, I think they need to be under a different agency because this agency actively not just participated, but led this creation of a censorship apparatus. It wasn't, and now that them saying, oh, we were just doing research, it was a mass flagging and censorship operation that was coordinated with a broader effort to pressure the platforms to do more censorship. That was going on since 2016. So yeah, I think it's disingenuous to suggest that that they were just doing research.
Mr. Chenoweth, as the litigation, like Missouri versus Biden, you mentioned the Murthy case, I guess it's Murthy in the Supreme Court, I guess is the name of it there. Courts have differed sometimes with themselves on what level of government actions constitute interference with freedom of speech. Why is that a challenge? And how should courts resolve it?
I think there's a concern that there may be a category mistake here, Mr. Chairman, because a lot of the precedents, because the government hasn't done this kind of censorship by and large going back 10, 20, 40, 50 years. And so the precedents that exist at the Supreme Court are largely precedents where there have been private entities that have been doing censorship and have been sued. And then, this is Bantam Books as an example of this. And then the question is, well, was that private conduct turned into state action? And so if you're suing a private entity and you're trying to, because if it is a private entity, it's truly private action, then the First Amendment doesn't apply. So if you're suing a private entity and saying that they engaged in state action, then there's precedents that suggest how do you know that there's state action there. And the tests have been things like coercion and so forth, also entanglement, also the way that you described it, Mr. Chairman, is just how involved are we here? But the reason for that is because we want to be very careful about saying that a private entity has become a public entity. We need to be very careful about that. We need to draw that line carefully, because if that private entity is treated as a public entity, then its liberties have really been constricted, particularly by the First Amendment then applying to it. Yeah. But that's not what we're talking about here. In Murphy v. Missouri, we didn't sue any private entities. We're suing the government. And the question is, what's the standard that affects the government when the government is engaged in government-led censorship? And the standard there shouldn't be coercion. It shouldn't be the standard that applies when you're suing a private entity. It needs to be the First Amendment standard. And the text of the First Amendment says abridge, and that means diminish. And you're telling me that nothing that CISA did diminished free speech, that it didn't diminish speech? Of course it did. The whole point of it was to diminish speech.
Undoubtedly it did. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has long since expired. I thank you for that. But I now recognize Ranking Member Ivey for 5 minutes for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we have some different views on this. And I'll just tell you what my thinking is on some of this. I guess we draw the line in different places as to what role government should play with respect to public speech or comments. For example, we've talked about this in previous hearings. I mean, tobacco, for example. When I was a young kid, there was an argument back and forth about whether it caused cancer or not, whether it was detrimental to health. I think we certainly hit the point in the 80s or 90s or so where it became clear, I think, scientifically, that it was causing a problem. And the government decided, in addition to private support from the medical community, that public service announcement campaigns across the country to try and reduce the level of smoking was in order. In fact, that was part of the government the settlement with the tobacco companies. So those ads started running, and I think even you can find now people who dispute whether tobacco causes cancer or not. But I think it's pretty clear that that was the government effort with respect to speech that took a stand that was in favor of public safety. Seatbelts is another one. We've got a number of these we could go through. COVID, I know, is controversial, so I hate to walk into the hornet's nest, but some of those points, I appreciate the points you made, Mr. Chenoweth. Some of them, I kind of was definitely on the side of we need to do something like that. We're like injecting bleach will cure you of COVID was one of those. So I take the point that, and I guess that was Mr. Lukowski on the trip from Virginia to Baltimore, was talking about how, sometimes the government's not right, sometimes it is, and that's a fair point. But I think what I'm hearing from the table, at least from Mr. Chenoweth and Mr. Schellenberger, is government should never be taking positions on what's accurate or true or correct, and that's not really my view. But Mr. Chenoweth, I want to give you a chance to, if you give me a brief response, is there a line that you would draw where you think it's okay for the government to take public statements, disagree with information that's out there? And then here's the line, I think, for the censorship piece. Reach out to platforms and say, add content or flag it or whatever.
I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem with the government taking a position on anything. I think that that's government speech and that's fine. I think the problem is when you have the government reaching out to platforms to shut down other speech, that becomes censorship. And in terms of when they can and can't do that, if they're reaching out to a platform to shut down unlawful speech, which I would suggest.
Sure, that's fine, yeah.
The child
porn,
example.
Sure. Terrorism.
No problem with that at all.
Okay.
But if you're reaching out to a platform to shut down lawful speech, such as Dr. Kuldorf's tweet about who should and shouldn't get vaccinated, that was lawful speech.
Let me ask you draw the line on that. When you say shut down, remove would be, I guess what you mean by shut down, is flagging it or adding comments to it. Are you okay with that?
Well, I'm certainly not okay with the government flagging it or the government adding comments.
Government asking the social, because the government's not controlling the social media platforms, but asking the social media, hey, can you flag that? And my view too is that is the decision that's made by the social media platforms. I don't think it's the Sopranos coming to get them otherwise, but go ahead.
I think that's diminishing and therefore abridging speech and therefore a direct violation of the First Amendment.
So the government asking, I don't know, Twitter or X, whatever they call it now, to flag statement X is an abridgment and a First Amendment violation?
Absolutely, if that speech is
Automatically.
lawful speech.
Okay.
I think that's a very clear and easy line to draw.
Okay. I define abridged a little differently than you do, I think, in the First Amendment context, but that's okay. I did want to read this piece here, too, though. This is from Yoel Roth. I think this is kind of a fact issue. He's formerly at Twitter and testified here on the front of the Oversight Committee on February 8th. He's talking about threats that were coming over the internet. In an effort to get ahead of these kinds of threats, Twitter and other tech companies work to build closer information sharing relationships with law enforcement, such as the FBI. In the recent reporting known as the Twitter Files, there was an attempt to portray interactions between Twitter and other social media platforms and the FBI as politically driven interference. My experience of these interactions was different. Across the FBI, DHS, and other agencies, the professionals responsible for combating malign foreign interference in elections did so with integrity and the utmost care and respect for the laws of this country, including the First Amendment. I would ask that we make this part of the record. I see I'm over my time.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I do have a couple of other articles here, testimony. One is the testimony of Kate Starbird, Director of the Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington, and the other is Mark Rogers, co-founder of the Cyber Threat Intelligence League.
Without objection, order to be submitted with the record.
Mr. Chairman, could I respond to the Yael Roth point? Is that possible?
Well, let me see, Mr. Chenoweth, I think there's a reasonably good likelihood we'll enter a second round. We want to stick to the time so no members disadvantaged. That's true. I'll tell you, let me see, we'll see whether we get through the other witnesses. We'll try to remember to come back to the point at some point in time if we can, if a member's time permits. Sorry about that, Mr. Chenoweth. With that, I recognize Ms. Green for 5 minutes. Is that right? Yeah, Ms. Green for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, and thank you so much, and thank you for doing this hearing. CISA claims that it has not engaged in censorship, and that is a complete and total lie. Mr. Schellenberger, I read an article recently that you had written, and it was about me. The fact that I had been censored, and it was through CISA engaging with the DNC, the NAACP, Homeland Security, flagging my tweets, writing tickets on them, and also, amazingly, which to my shock, I read details of these tickets, making up complete falsehoods about me. Talk about misinformation. This is taxpayer-funded government agencies lying about a member of Congress, about what I said, taking other people's statements and writing it in context of what I said on my own social media, then taking down my actual social media post, which is shocking, absolutely shocking. So, Mr. Schellenberger, I'd like to ask you a little bit more. You worked on the Twitter files, and I want to thank you for that work, and thank you for writing this article, calling attention to the fact that me as a member of Congress had my own First Amendment violated. That's also a First Amendment violation on behalf of my entire district because they elected me and sent me here to represent them. So thank you very much for that. What most surprised you or further alarmed you when you learned everything you did through Twitter files?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I mean, I think I was shocked to see members of Congress being censored, and that was shocking to me. We were shocked to see how many government employees were constantly emailing Twitter. And Carlos Monge, an executive I cited in my Twitter files on the Hunter Biden laptop, complained about all the pressure that they were getting from the federal government. I think the most shocking thing, though, was it was sort of like what you're saying, is that the censorship was actually in service of disinformation efforts. And that what you're really looking at when you're looking at the Cyber Threat Intelligence League is an operation that looks like a military intelligence operation that clearly they drew right from fighting terrorists abroad, and they turned those tools against the American people. So censorship was just one of the countermeasures that they had set up. But with the Hunter Biden laptop, it was a disinformation campaign aimed at tying the laptop to the Russians, even though there was no evidence for it. And so you might have a situation where Yoel Roth is like, oh, I've got a good relationship with the FBI, but he's the target of an operation that was aimed at convincing him that there was something suspicious about the Hunter Biden laptop, even though they had the receipt from Hunter Biden and they had the FBI subpoena taking the laptop in December 2019. And so, in fact, their own review of the laptop, it came back that it was not the result of a hack. And so what you see is that, I think, to what Mr. Chenoweth was describing, is it's not just coercion. They're actually sort of, I don't know how do you describe it, they're kind of working these guys. They're using a lot of, they're being very sweet often. It's often very kind and friendly, a lot of trying to be like, we're all on the same team here. You have to remember, like, I think it was like over 96% of all Twitter executive donations went to Democrats, so it's a very partisan institution to begin with. So they're already primed to believe that there maybe is something wrong with that Hunter Biden laptop. And so what was important is not just that it was censored, but really that Twitter participated in the disinformation effort to create the perception that there was something illegitimate about it, that it was a result of a hack and leak.
Right, and so did Facebook, and so did Google.
That's right.
Largely the internet. Speaking of the partisan difference there, we have who was being censored. President Donald J. Trump, Senator Thom Tillis, Speaker Newt Gingrich, Governor Mike Huckabee, Congressman Thomas Massie, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Newsmax, the Babylon Bee, Sean Hannity, Molly Hemingway, Harmeet Dillon, Charlie Kirk, Candace Owens, Jack Pacific, Tom Fitton, James O'Keefe, Benny Johnson, Michelle Malkin, Sean Davis, Dave Rubin, Paul Sperry, Tracy Beans, Chanel Ryan, and then add in the most offensive, what I consider to be the most offensive, an untold number of everyday Americans of all political affiliations. These are people that don't have powerful platforms like me as a member of Congress. These are average American citizens that rely on the government to protect their rights, their freedom of speech, and it's outrageous, Mr. Chairman. I hope that we can, I certainly would like to completely defund CISA. It's an agency that should not exist. It's violated the American people's rights. We should completely get rid of it, and it shouldn't be entitled to do this anymore. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. I recognize Ms. Clark for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Ivey, and good afternoon. Before I begin, I want to correct some statements made by the chairman about Jen Easterling and CISA. First, Jen Easterling never recommended regulating cognitive infrastructure. I ask unanimous consent to submit into the record an article from The Hill containing her full quote. On a related manner, aside from cyber incident reporting, CISA is not a regulator. It has no authority to regulate critical infrastructure outside of cyber incident reporting. Second, when asked at an appropriations hearing, Jen Easterling responded to questions about switchboarding in the present tense. And it is true that CISA no longer engages in switchboarding. Switchboarding occurred during the previous administration. And finally, the CISA Advisory Committee's MDM subcommittee does not exist any longer and hasn't existed for over a year. Every recommendation the subcommittee made while it has existed is on the website. So having said that, there's been a lot of discussion and fear-mongering about the work of DHS and CISA in particular, and I appreciate this opportunity to set the record straight. Mr. Schellenberger, in your testimony, you advocate for abolishing CISA, an agency created by legislation led by former committee chairman Mike McCall, a Republican, and signed into law by former President Donald Trump. At the time, President Trump stated that CISA would, and I quote, lead federal government's civilian response to cyber threats against our nation. And we've had many, many threats. The men and women of the new Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency will be on the front lines of our cyber defense. They will partner with the private sector and all levels of government to defend America's power grids, banks, telecommunications, and other critical parts of our economy. As the cyber battleship evolves, this new agency will ensure that we confront the full range of threats from nation states, cyber criminals, and other malicious actors, of which there are many. This is an enormous mission. Over the past 5 years, CISA has rapidly built capacity to help state and local governments and critical infrastructure defend against and build resilience to a range of cyber threats. CISA spends $45 million of its nearly $3 billion budget on election security. So, Mr. Schellenberger, do you know what percent of CISA's budget, overall budget, that is? Well, let me tell you that's about 1.5% of its overall budget. It's about 1.5%. Of the $45 million CISA spends on election security, about $2 million of those funds are used to support efforts to counter influence operations. Mr. Schellenberger, do you know what percentage of CISA's budget that is?
Too much. I mean,
It's not even 1/10% of CISA's overall budget.
And yet here we
Mr.
are
Chair,
debating
hold on,
it.
excuse me. I'm reclaiming my time. Mr. Chairman, at the outset, it is clear that CISA has not engaged in any nefarious or unconstitutional activity. There is simply no evidence of it, but suggesting to abolish an agency because you disagree with less than 2% of what it does is just not a serious recommendation. So let me thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Crane for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today. I want to say thank you to those of you on the panel for showing up. I want to start with just asking the panel generally, do you trust the federal government to censor speech? I'll start with you, Mr. Schellenberg.
No.
I do not.
The government should not be censoring speech.
Absolutely not.
Would all of you gentlemen say that generally you're students of history? Generally?
Generally.
Okay. What kind of governments typically are most likely to censor their people? Mr. Schellenberg, I'll start with you.
Authoritarian and totalitarian ones.
Yeah. What about you, sir?
I agree.
I agree.
Mr. Lukowski?
I agree, and I'd add ones that aren't confident in their own abilities to govern.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, why do you think these types of governments typically want to control and censor the speech of their own citizens?
Because they are behaving undemocratically in a variety of ways, and they don't want to be called out for it.
Absolutely. What about you, Mr. Chenoweth?
Well, I think there's many reasons. I think they want to hold on to power, and anything that's happening in their society that appears to be out of control, or that's out of their power, is something that is a threat to them being dislodged from power. And so they want to control the information atmosphere in order to hold on to power.
Mr. Abdo?
Generally to silence dissent.
Mr. Lukowski?
I would say it's out of a sense of arrogance. It's a sense that they're right and that anyone who disagrees with them is wrong, and that needs to be corrected through a proper degree of humility.
Mr. Lukowski, do you see any of those signs that you just pointed out, the arrogance in this federal government?
Absolutely. I think it was on vivid display during the COVID response and a number of other areas.
Mr. Schellenberger, how about you? Do you see any of those signs in this current government?
Yes, many signs.
Do you think it's rational to believe that a private company, even one as large as Twitter or Facebook, might feel intimidated or coerced if the most powerful government in the history of the world contacted them to alert them to a post that they found problematic?
Yes, and we saw that intimidation repeatedly in the Twitter files.
What about the rest of you guys? Do you think they might feel coerced or intimidated?
Absolutely, and we've had 4 federal judges who have found that, in fact, that happened.
In your opinion, do you think the American people have any reason to question the official narratives put out by this government, both this one right now and past governments?
Yes, many reasons.
Mr. Schellenberger, can you go into a short list of official positions that they've released on certain things that you found to be problematic and rightly see the American people as being rational to question those narratives?
I would say the Afghanistan pullout, the Ukraine war, the efficacy of the COVID vax, the lack of transparency on COVID origins, the cost of the Inflation Reduction Act, viability of renewables. Anyway, how long do you have?
Yeah, I had some of those same ones on my list. What about the Hunter Biden laptop? Would that be on your list, sir?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was clearly a disinformation campaign that involved existing and former government officials.
Yeah, what do you gentlemen typically think when you see the billboards pulled up with official statements from individuals at CISA? You know, nothing to see here, nothing to see here. What do you guys think about that? Just more of the same CYA, cover your ass type deals? Mr. Schellenberger, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm mixed between it being sinister and comedic.
Yeah. What about you, Mr. Chenoweth?
I think that there's a misimpression on the part of some of these individuals that if they act through third parties that they're not violating the First Amendment. They're wrong about that, but they're not all lawyers, I get that. But they need to understand that they are blatantly violating the First Amendment when they work through third parties to achieve censorship.
Mr. Abdi, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, Congressman. I think the question, the constitutional one that the Supreme Court set out in 1963, is whether the government has coerced the suppression of speech. And I'll give you just a couple of examples where I think it's actually important for the government to be able to contribute to public discourse and also to contribute to persuading private actors into making decisions about the speech. In 2004, the New York Times was leaked information about the Bush administration's warrantless wiretapping program. And members of the Bush administration met with the New York Times and convinced the New York Times that to disclose that information in 2004 would result in deaths and the disclosure of undercover sources. And the New York Times held on to that story for a year. I happen to think the New York Times probably made the wrong decision in being persuaded by the Bush administration to hold on to that story for a year. But I think it's relevant to the New York Times' decision-making what the government thinks about the likelihood that disclosing that information would cause real harm to the national security interests of the United States, even though the New York Times' publication of that story was unquestionably constitutionally protected. And so I think there is a role for government in persuading private actors to take into account the harms of the independent editorial decisions they make.
Thank you, Mr.
But the New York
Chairman.
Times that was the New York Times' own speech that it was holding back on, not a third party's speech.
I think that the Bantam Books case is a case about third-party speech. It was a lawsuit brought against, I think inconsistently with what you said earlier, Mr. Chenoweth, it was a lawsuit brought against the Rhode Island Commission on Morality and Youth, arguing that that commission had exceeded its authority in attempting to coerce book distributors and publishers into taking off of their shelves material that the commission had deemed to be obscene or offensive. And I think
Thank you.
Thank you.
I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Crane. I think the witnesses, I'd actually love to hear from all of you more. Our time is unfortunately limited. We have another panel. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for this panel of witnesses. We would ask the witnesses to respond to those in writing pursuant to Committee Rule 7D. The hearing record will remain open for 10 days for that. These witnesses are dismissed, and the committee will be in recess for 15 minutes to commence with the second panel. The Committee on Homeland Security Subcommittee on Oversight, Investigations, and Accountability will come to order. I'm pleased to have as our second panel, a panel of witnesses from the Department of Homeland Security before us today to speak on this very important topic. I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. I would now like to formally introduce our additional witnesses. I hope I'm going to get your name right, sir. Mr. Iranga Kahangama is the Assistant Secretary for Cyber, Infrastructure, Risk, and Resilience at the Department of Homeland Security. Ms. Mona Harrington is the Assistant Director for the National Risk Management Center at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I thank these witnesses for being here today. The chair will now recognize each witness for oral statements. Each oral statement will be limited to 5 minutes, but submitted written statements by witnesses will appear in the hearing record in their entirety. I now recognize Mr. Kahangama for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivey, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the Department of Homeland Security's efforts to counter the impacts of foreign influence operations and disinformation impacting our homeland security. I serve as the department's Assistant Secretary for Cyber, Infrastructure, Risk, and Resilience. In this role, I lead the department's efforts on cybersecurity and critical infrastructure policy. Nation-state adversaries such as Russia, China, and Iran are likely to continue to conduct overt and covert influence operations to shape U.S. policy and undermine trust in U.S. government institutions, social cohesion, and democratic processes. With the upcoming election cycle of 2024, our adversaries are likely seeking more opportunity than ever before. The U.S. intelligence community's annual threat assessment for 2023 notes that the People's Republic of China seeks to expand its malign influence campaigns to better support its political, economic, and security goals. Beijing utilizes a broad array of highly sophisticated covert, overt, licit, and illicit means to conduct these operations. Their US-based influence operations are focused on shaping US policy and the American public's perception of the PRC. Russia presents one of the most serious foreign influence threats to the United States because it utilizes its intelligence services, proxies, and wide-ranging influence tools to try to sow discord inside the United States and divide Western allies. Moscow views US elections as opportunities for malign influence as part of its broader foreign policy strategy. While these risks are not new, our interconnected world, the anonymous nature of the internet, and emerging technologies change the nature of that threat. For example, these same adversaries are likely to use generative artificial intelligence tools and strategies to improve the quality, scope, and scale of their influence operations. The widespread proliferation and accessibility of these AI tools will boost foreign malign influence campaigns by enabling threat actors to create synthetic text, audio, and images at a lower cost and with higher quality. DHS is charged with safeguarding the United States against threats to its security. In recent years, many of those threats have been exacerbated by disinformation. As part of its mission, DHS has worked across multiple administrations to address and mitigate different forms of disinformation that threaten authorized missions of the department. Examples of such efforts include working to combat human smuggling, protecting critical infrastructure, and responding to foreign malign influence. In the context of these threats, the department takes seriously our responsibility to safeguard the United States, its people, and its values. Providing the public with accurate information in response to foreign malign influence campaigns is critical to fulfilling DHS's congressionally mandated mission. The department is committed to carrying out its mission in a way that ensures the privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties are protected for all Americans. This includes the freedom of speech. These rights are fundamental to our freedom and to who we are as a nation. Like everything we do, the work of DHS to address foreign influence operations must be consistent with the Constitution and in compliance with U.S. laws, regulations, and policies. The department works every day to ensure that all of our activities are carried out in a manner that protects these values. DHS is committed to continuing to build resilience to foreign influence operations and disinformation in close coordination with our interagency partners. In these efforts, DHS will continue operating within our authority and in accordance with all legal requirements with respect for the constitutional rights and civil liberties of all Americans. I thank you again for the opportunity to testify here today, and I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kahangama. I now recognize Ms. Harrington for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivey, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the National Risk Management Center's efforts to build resilience to the impacts of foreign influence operations and disinformation targeting election infrastructure. First and foremost, at the core of the department's mission is a commitment to safeguard the American people, our homeland, and our values. We carry out this mission in a manner that protects privacy, civil rights, civil liberties, including the freedom of speech of all Americans. These rights are fundamental to our freedom and to who we are as a nation. I began serving as the Assistant Director of the National Risk Management Center, the NRMC, in October of 2022. I have over 20 years of federal government experience working in different leadership roles. My expertise spans cybersecurity, strategy, risk management, critical infrastructure, human capital, operations, and the implementation of best practices in critical infrastructure environments. I have led efforts to further the NRMC's critical analytic support to CISA's mission to understand, manage, and reduce risk to the cyber and physical infrastructure Americans rely on every day. Our work enables CISA and other federal, state, local, tribal, territorial, and critical infrastructure partners to apply actionable analysis in support of risk management decisions. Over the last year, we have produced 1,600 tailored products and engaged over 6,300 stakeholders to improve security of U.S. critical infrastructure. The Election Security and Resilience Team is one of many efforts within the NRMC. The Election Security and Resilience Team works collaboratively with election officials, federal and private sector partners. The collaboration includes working in a nonpartisan manner on a voluntary basis with state and local election officials to improve the security of election infrastructure necessary for the elections they are responsible for administering. CISA provides voluntary support to these officials with intelligence and information sharing, guidance, and best practices, and no-cost security services such as cyber incident response, cybersecurity assessments, and exercises. CISA's work on foreign influence operations and disinformation is a very small part of the Election Security and Resilience Team, and it's narrowly scoped. CISA's work in this space includes developing publicly available resources to inform and assist stakeholders and the public. For example, we released a guide that highlights tactics used by foreign actors, such as manipulating content service providers or defacing public websites. These products are intended to build awareness of how foreign malign actors spread false or misleading information. CISA's work has been transparent, briefed to Congress many times, including this committee, and is available to the public on its website at CISA.gov. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Harrington. Members will now be recognized by order of seniority for 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Ms. Harrington, there was a CISA video on YouTube that had the fictional character, I think her name was Susan or Sharon, and she was being, she said that the idea was that she had interacting with her uncle on social media. He was posting things that were disinformation or malinformation or something like that. And it concluded with with a recommendation that she report the disinformation from her uncle. CISA took that down. Why did CISA take that video down?
Representative, respectfully, I'm not aware of that. That must predate my time. I'm not at all familiar with that.
How about Mr. Kahangama? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not familiar with that video.
All right, let me ask you generally, Mr. Kahangama, and then I'll go back to Ms. Harrington. How have DHS and CISA's efforts or activity in concerning dealing with disinformation, misinformation, malinformation changed as in consequence of the Missouri versus Biden preliminary injunction that's been upheld by the Fifth Circuit, or otherwise since the last election?
Thank you, Chair, for the question. While I understand and am aware of the Missouri v. Biden case, I understand that that is still ongoing pending litigation in front of the Supreme Court, and so I'm unable to speak to the specifics of that case. But what I will say is that the department and its work in combating disinformation in defense of its specific mission areas is done with robust oversight in coordination with civil rights and civil liberties, our statutorily mandated offices, as well as in close coordination with our Office of General Counsel.
Well, see, that's what concerns me, is that's been said to us for a number of years. In fact, it's always been said by CISA, by DHS, that the recital that we're concerned about rights under the First Amendment, and we always are carefully taking action to avoid infringing those or abridging free speech. And yet, a district court has found, an appellate court has affirmed that, and of course it's still pending for final determination. So I'm not asking you about the facts or the determinations in that case. What I'm asking you is, let me put it this way, because I asked you how things have changed, whether things have changed. Since that decision has been made, has DHS changed the way it deals with disinformation?
Again, thank you for the question, Chair. I'm not in a position to answer anything as it relates specific to the implications of that case.
All right, let me ask this then. Since the last election, disregard the case if you want to, how is DHS dealing with disinformation differently than it did then?
Thank you, Chair, for the question. DHS's approach to election security has been around election infrastructure, making sure that they are preventing the infrastructure from being impacted by cybersecurity issues, and working to advance the mission of state and local partners that we trust as the authoritative voices on elections in this election space.
Yeah, but I didn't ask you about how you're protecting like elections infrastructure from hacking and so forth. What I'm asking you about are your efforts vis-a-vis disinformation. Let me just ask you, you still have an MDM team, don't you?
I do not have one at the Department of Homeland Security.
All right, Ms. Harrington, is there still an MDM team at CISA?
Representative, yes. We
Okay.
still have an MDM team.
How is the MDM team and the other efforts relating to the MDM team concerning disinformation, how have you changed those at CISA?
Representative, the work that we do around MDM are threefold. One, we are putting out literacy documents.
Don't give me a discourse about three parts. What I'm asking is, what's changed? What's changed, if anything? If you're proceeding in dealing with disinformation in exactly the way you did then, which you've contended respects all First Amendment rights, notwithstanding evidence to the contrary, say that. But otherwise, I want you to tell me how it's changed. How have you changed your practices in this area?
Representative, respectfully, I'm not aware of direct changes to the ongoing litigation.
I'm not trying to qualify it in terms of the fact that we covered that with Mr. Kahangama. What I'm asking is, leave aside the litigation. Since the election in 2020, how have you changed, has CHS changed the way you're dealing with disinformation?
Representative, I can tell you the three ways that we deal with disinformation and counter foreign influence.
So you can't tell me how you've changed them.
First of all, going back to 20, my tenure, that predates my tenure at the agency, but I'm happy to tell you what we are doing.
Are you aware, by virtue of policies you've been exposed to, managerial discussions at CISA, whether there have been changes to the way CISA addresses disinformation?
Representative, I'm not aware of what you're referencing as far as changes.
Okay, you're not aware of any. That's concerning to me. By what justification does a government agency tasked with curtailing and preventing computer hacking stray into governing or babysitting Americans' free speech on social media?
Representative, respectfully, we don't censor.
Okay. What is the source of authority for DHS? You know, Ms. Clark said in her questioning on our first panel, and I think she's exactly right, that CISA and, excuse me, I see my time's expired and I've let it go over. Let me just stop there and yield back, and I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Ivey, for his 5 minutes.
If I might, I would let Mr. Leander go.
Dr. Tanadar is recognized.
Chairman Bishop, thank you for holding this hearing, and Ranking Member Ivey, thank you for your incredible kindness to let me speak here out of order, maybe a little earlier than I'm supposed to, but thank you so much. CISA has been incredibly transparent about its interactions with social media companies on the topic of election-related mis- and disinformation. In numerous hearings before this committee and others, witnesses from CISA repeatedly told Congress that they were in regular communication with social media companies, and even told us that these companies were taking a very aggressive posture towards election-related misinformation. Chairman Bishop, I would like to enter into the record the transcripts of a hearing this committee held in 2019 regarding how CISA was preparing for the 2020 election.
Without objection, so ordered.
In fact, I think it's incredible. In fact, I think it's interesting that it was not until Donald Trump lost the 2020 election that my Republican colleagues began to take issues with CISA's disinformation activities. Ms. Harrington, can you speak to CISA's transparency efforts in this area and describe what the agency has done to explain to Congress, the media, and the public its election-related disinformation work?
Representative, thank you for the question. CISA has all of its materials on its website. We are incredibly transparent. We have all of our publications regarding disinformation and countering foreign influence published publicly. All of that information can be found there. We regularly work with state and local partners. All of our partnerships and communication around the work that we do can be found publicly, and it's on our website.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Appreciate both of you being here and for your testimony. Chairman Bishop, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Tanadar, and I recognize Mr. Ezell for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today. Recently, documents were obtained under the Freedom of Information Act by Americans for Prosperity regarding DHS Disinformation Governance Board, which was stood up by the Biden administration and was almost immediately shut down due to massive public pushback. Behind me today are two of these documents. Well, besides the title, there isn't much that we can learn from these documents. Mr. Kahagma, help me fill in some of the words on this blank page. What authorities does DHS believe it has to counter misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation?
Thank you, Representative, for the question. DHS believes its authorities that authorize its specific mission use cases provides us the authority to provide correct, accurate information in response to false information that may directly impact the operations of the department.
Also behind me, as well, is a completely redacted memo titled Ukraine MDM Playbook. Do you think DHS has the authority to control public conversations on foreign wars? If so, where do you believe this is under their mission?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Could you please repeat the question?
Do you think DHS has the authority to control public conversations on foreign wars?
No, DHS does not have that authority. We do not monitor the content of American speech.
Very good. And suppressing domestic speech included in memos, is suppressing domestic speech included in the memo strategy?
I'm sorry?
Is suppressing domestic speech included in the memo's strategy?
I'm not familiar with the memo that you're referencing.
The Homeland Security Advisory Committee recommended to DHS that it should, quote, bring disinformation to the attention of platforms hosting these falsehoods, end quote. I ask that DHS shares the committee their communications with these platforms on this topic. Is that something you can provide?
Respectfully, Congressman, I would have to defer to our Office of Legislative Affairs, who I believe is already in contact with the committee staff about document production and anything else that can be shared, but we'd be happy to.
Thank you very much. Ms. Harrington, does CISA have any plans to combat MDM during the 2024 election?
Representative, respectfully, CISA will continue doing the work that it's currently doing, which is essentially amplifying election official voices. We have a rumor control page up on CISA.gov, and we also are putting out literacy publications so the American people can spot disinformation tactics and learn about the tactics that foreign adversaries are using to essentially spread disinformation.
Thank you. Recently, the director of CISA testified before Congress that, quote, the most critical infrastructure in our cognitive infrastructure, building that resilience to misinformation and disinformation, I think is incredibly important. I want to repeat that again. The director of CISA testified before Congress, and I quote, the most critical infrastructure is our cognitive infrastructure. Building that resilience to misinformation and disinformation, I think is incredibly important, end quote. I look at CISA's website and cognitive infrastructure is not listed as a sector of CISA is tasked with protecting. What does cognitive infrastructure mean?
Representative, in executing our mission, we are guided by the definition of critical infrastructure in Presidential Policy Directive 21. That is, the U.S. government determines critical infrastructure by that PPD 21, and there are 16 critical infrastructure sectors that are considered vital to the United States, includes their assets, systems, and networks, whether physical or virtual, that are so important that their incapacitation or destruction would have a debilitating effect on security, national economic security, national public health or safety, or any combination thereof.
Again, what does cognitive infrastructure mean? I don't get it.
Representative, respectfully, that is how we execute our mission with the definition of critical infrastructure defined in PPD 21.
Do you think that DHS has this authority?
Our authorities are outlined in PPD 21.
Have you discussed the cognitive infrastructure with Director Easterly?
Representative, again, critical infrastructure is defined in PPD 21. It's got the 16 sectors of which are the sectors which make up critical infrastructure of the United States.
I'm concerned that we continue to find examples that seem clear that the Biden administration is weaponizing the federal government against its citizens. These agencies are out of control, and this committee will not stop until we hold folks accountable for that. And for Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Ivey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want a couple of follow-up points from our previous panel. I did want to say we had a number of questions addressing, or actually statements suggesting that the social media platforms were coerced by the government and that they didn't have the ability to resist government requests or flagging of information. And I did want to reiterate the point that I made in my opening statement about how these social media platforms have dealt with this. So a post flagged by the EIP, Election Integrity Partnership, platforms took action on 35%. 21% of those were labeled, 13% were removed, and 1 were left soft blocked, which I believe means that they don't permit the algorithm to, allow it to go viral. No action was taken on 65% of these interactions. So we might disagree about, whether they should be doing this or not, but I don't think Elon Musk has had any trouble resisting or disagreeing with the Biden administration. And my recollection from when I worked with Microsoft was that they didn't have trouble disagreeing with the government at the time either. So with respect to the issue about rumor control and disinformation tactics, Ms. Harrington, I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit on that. What does that mean? What kinds of activities are you taking, or is your entity taking with respect to those kinds of situations?
Representative, so we have a rumor control page set up, which helps to amplify election official voices. So the state and locals that are running the elections, we have a number of rumor narratives and the reality, providing factual information. Again, that can be transparent. That could be found transparently on our website. We work closely with state and local election officials, and we have that all cross-linked to, for example, the National Association Secretary of States, also the National Association of State Election Director websites, and there are a number of other sources so that Americans can read that information and make their own decisions about the facts surrounding how election administration works. So that is one mechanism that we have where we amplify election official voices and put out actual information to educate and ensure that we are putting out literacy information to the American people to make good decisions.
All right, so in Maryland, I believe we had a misinformation scenario that spread about the last day to request a mail-in ballot and about the process of voting in person. Are those the types of scenarios that you're referencing, or would that be addressed by a different mechanism?
Representative, we don't go into specific detail around the rules for each specific jurisdiction, if you will, but we have more broad narratives that are corrected on there. As you know, elections are decentralized and each state has their own specific rules and requirements that govern how they run their elections. So we don't get into that level of granularity, but more broad narratives.
Well, give me an example of a scenario where you would have gotten involved.
So, for example, we have an entry on Rumor vs. Reality that says voting system hardware and software undergo testing from federal, state, and/or election authorities. And the rumor on that is that voting system software is not at all reviewed or tested, period. So that would be an example of an entry, broad entry.
All right, and then what would you do to address that? How did you, or if that's actual, how did you respond?
That's an actual listing on the Rumor vs. Reality webpage. So I'm just demonstrating the broad narratives that we try to correct. We have other entries on there, such as voters are protected by state and federal law from threats or intimidations at polls, including from election observers. So that's another reality that we have on there. And the rumor associated with that reality is observers in polling places are permitted to intimidate voters, campaign, and/or interfere with voting. So you could see their broad narratives that we just put out to educate, but we don't get into the granularity of specific jurisdictions per your question.
All right, well, I see my time has expired, so I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Strong for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Bishop. Ms. Harrington at an event for the Center for Strategic and International Studies on November the 1st, 2022, CISA Director Jen Easterly said, and I quote, we make sure people understand the tactics around disinformation and that Americans understand, how to build resilience against it, how to recognize it, how to investigate it, asking about the source, questioning it, not amplifying it. Who does CISA suggest as a credible source during these education efforts, and how does CISA make that determination?
Representative, could you please repeat the question?
How does CISA suggest a credible source during these educational efforts, and how does CISA make the determination of that credible source?
Respectfully, I apologize. I still am not clear on what your question is.
I'll move further. Does CISA partner with any outside experts or entities in developing its educational MDM content? Do you use outside sources to do this effort?
Representative, I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. We put out literacy publications to educate around disinformation and countering foreign influence tactics. They're educational materials. They can be found on our website.
Thank you, I appreciate that. My question is, do you use outside sources or do you do it all within your team?
Representative, let me get
I'll
back to
reclaim
your
my
staff
time.
on that.
That is not a hard question.
I'm not certain if
I'll make
there's
it
a
easy. I'll move
contractor
on.
that
I'll move
assists
on.
with publication.
Ms. Harrington, what types of MDM efforts does CISA currently have underway? What type of efforts?
Representative, the 3 efforts that we have and that we continue to work on, as I previously stated, are the rumor control page, and I gave some examples just a moment ago, literacy publications. We've got things like tactics of disinformation, disinformation stops with you, other infographics, social media bots, infographic set, optical illusions, other publications that you can find on our website. And we amplify election official voices as the state and locals who know best how their processes and systems work. Those are the 3 efforts that CISA has within the disinformation countering foreign influence.
Thank you. Does CISA work with other DHS components on combating MDM? And if they do, which ones do they work with?
Representative, respectfully, I'm not aware of any coordination across other components.
Thank you. Sir, the next question. On November the 15th of this year, you spoke at an Aspen Institute summit where you said that DHS has many different operational applications of AI that we are actively using, whether that is generative AI or more traditional machine learning. What operation using AI has DHS already undertaken? What are they already doing?
Thank you, Representative. Thank you for the question. Obviously, generative AI has been very much popular in the news, and so this has been a really interesting space for us to do a lot of work for the department operationally across many of the components. Our OCIO recently put out some guidance about how employees can propose projects and to use AI as a means to make work more efficient and more a better use of an employee's time. For instance, on the cybersecurity mission, when we are working to protect federal networks, we can apply machine learning so that we can inject indicators of compromise, malware samples, computer viruses. We can use machine learning and AI tools to automate that so that we're more able to quickly identify where vulnerabilities may exist and how to patch them. We also want to explore the ability to use AI in different mission spaces. Our Homeland Security Investigations is using it on the countering child sex exploitation and CSAM material that we can better identify victims and protect those communities using artificial intelligence. We also have pilots going where we want to use them on the border to better scan for goods in the Customs and Border Protection mission. And so we have a lot of actual good news stories in this space that we're excited about.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Crane for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is for both of you. Were you here for the panel prior?
We were in another room, but we were able to watch some of it on the TV.
Okay. I'm going to start with you, Mr. K. I'll just say Mr. K. Is that all right? Or you go ahead and tell me how to pronounce it.
You can say Kahangama.
Kahangama, okay. Do you trust the government to censor American speech?
Respectfully, Congressman, the Department of Homeland Security does not censor content.
Okay. Did you hear Mr. Schellenberger's evidence about how our government was using some of its institutions and organizations to censor the speech of Americans on social media? Were you here for that?
I saw the hearing, the first part, yes.
Okay. So are you arguing that that wasn't censorship?
I'm not familiar with what exactly you're referencing.
Okay, well, he had emails going from our government to social media platforms flagging and requesting the removal of social media posts. Do you classify that as censorship?
So while I heard the testimony, Mr. Schellenberger, I haven't reviewed the specific documents that you are referencing, so I can't speak to the veracity of them.
Okay, well, let's just go general then. Do you think that it's censorship for the federal government to be reaching out to social media platforms and asking them to remove postings from American citizens?
Thank you, Congressman. I would reiterate that the Department of Homeland Security does not engage in content moderation conversations with social media companies.
Okay, that's not what I asked you. Okay, do you study history, Mr. K?
Generally.
Generally, okay. What about you, ma'am, Ms. Harrington? Generally?
Generally.
Okay. Typically, what types of governments censor their own people? Go ahead. Either of you.
Authoritative
Yeah.
dictatorship.
Sir?
Yeah, I would agree.
Do totalitarian governments do that? Yes, no? It's not hard.
Broadly, yes.
Do communistic governments do that? Socialistic governments do that? Why do you think they do that? Why do they think that they try and control the speech of their own people? Ma'am, Ms. Harrington? Yes?
Yes, I think that's correct. Probably political control.
Yeah, absolutely. Mr. K?
Yeah, I would agree.
Do you think it's important that we try not to become like them?
I believe this government is not like them. I believe we are respectful of our constitutional rights. We ensure that all the work that we are doing is protected by our civil liberties and civil rights offices, and we do that with respect to all of our freedoms, including...
Well, thank you, but I would actually respectfully disagree with that point of view. As a matter of fact, if you were paying attention to some of the evidence produced in the last panel, you would know that. As somebody who's involved in law enforcement, that was evidence, sir. That's what any law enforcement officer would consider evidence. Those emails going from our government to social media platforms, flagging and requesting the removal of posts and speech from American citizens. So you can sit there and you can give me all the little canned answers you want, but when you actually open your mind and are willing to look at the evidence being presented, it's obvious. Now, this shouldn't be a partisan issue. We all know that on this panel. It shouldn't be a Democrat or Republican issue. It should be, are we willing to become like other totalitarian governments, communistic governments, socialistic governments that censor the speech of our own people? And I hope you two take this very seriously, because I'm sure that many of the people that have participated in some of these communistic, totalitarian governments in history felt like they were doing the right thing. And so I hope that you guys take this very seriously, and I hope you take our Constitution very seriously and free speech, because I'll tell you this, it is most important to protect free speech, not when you agree with people, but when you disagree with them. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back in the chair's discretion. We'll do another round of questioning for the witnesses, so I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Harrington.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, perhaps the chair could do another round of questions.
You don't care to?
If, I do have some time constraints.
No one has to
certainly-
stay. No one has to stay, and we're not going to be long, but I've got another 5 minutes, and you
Yes,
don't
sir.
have to stay.
Yeah, no objection to that. No objection to that.
All right, good. Thanks, sir. And it's at the election of every member, whether they have further questions they want to ask. And so the chair will ask 5 minutes of questioning. If you'll restore my time to 5 minutes, please. Ms. Harrington, you've referenced a number of times that CISA operates a rumor control website where you correct things you've identified that are misinformation. You understand from the prior testimony and the questions of members, no one has an objection to CISA having a website publishing what it contends are corrections of rumors that are false, right? You understand that?
Yes.
Do you understand what the committee is concerned about in terms of CISA's prior conduct? Or do you find, are you unaware of the subject matter that we're concerned about?
I am aware. I'm aware of what you're concerned about, censorship, essentially. I am aware of that.
Okay. And do I understand your testimony previously be that CISA really hasn't changed its policies to avoid censoring?
Representative, respectfully, we don't censor.
Okay.
I can tell you what we are doing.
Okay, now hold on a second. So do you know what switchboarding is?
I am, was made familiar with that
Okay.
recently. I was not at the agency when that.
Okay, I'm really talking about CISA, not really talking about specific to your career. Obviously, you're here as a representative of CISA. Did CISA switchboard?
Yes, but please allow me to explain what I understand that.
Well, I just want to know what, because I understand we may get lost in exactly what switchboarding kind of includes, but you have a notion in your mind of what it is. Is CISA continuing to switchboard?
CISA is not switchboarding. CISA is not sending emails on behalf of election officials from both parties to social media companies. That is not happening.
When did CISA stop switchboarding?
My understanding, although it predates me, is that CISA stopped after the 20 cycle.
Why did it stop?
Representative, respectfully, again, this predates me, but my understanding is that CISA makes decisions to prioritize efforts based on where the most impact is and to align resources with priorities, and that was an agency decision. Again, that predates me, but my understanding is it stopped and it is no longer happening now, and it stopped in the 20 cycle.
See, my concern is if CISA stopped switchboarding because it thought switchboarding was a questionable practice or one that was exceedingly disapproved of, then that might satisfy me more. But what I understand you're saying is it's simply a resource allocation or prioritization determination, so you could resume switchboarding next week if you want to. Is that what you think?
Representative, respectfully, I understand that was an agency decision. Again, it predates me, and that activity is not occurring.
Yeah, but that's not what I asked you. I asked you whether you believe it to be true that CISA could resume switchboarding next week.
Representative, again, switchboarding is not occurring, and that stopped in the 20 cycle. Forwarding emails to social media, a limited number of emails from both parties to social media companies
In
is
that
not
case,
happening.
You would agree with me, would you not, that there's no reason that Congress shouldn't restrict CISA's authority to make sure that it cannot switchboard, since you're not doing it, right?
Representative, we are not censoring.
So we can provide that in law, make sure that that's a clear guardrail, correct?
Representative, respectfully, it's already in law.
Oh, really?
That we shouldn't censor, it's the First Amendment.
You shouldn't switchboard. I agree. I mean, that you've kind of hit the nail on the head with that
We are
last
not
statement.
censoring.
Because the problem
CISA
is...
doesn't censor.
The problem is whether switchboarding is censoring. And I think you just conflated the two, which is exactly the problem. Let me ask this question. Is CISA meeting on a regular basis with social media platforms?
CISA does not meet with social media platforms.
You said does not. Did it meet with social media platforms on a periodic basis?
I understand that it was meeting with them at a time, yes.
Monthly and then weekly during the run-up to the 2020 elections, correct?
I am not certain on completely what that cadence is.
Okay, I'll represent to you that that's what it was, since you don't know, but you should. They met with them monthly and then weekly leading up to the 2020 elections. Are those sorts of periodic meetings with social media companies still going on?
Representative, CISA's not meeting with social media companies.
Why did you stop?
I understand that that activity stopped in October of 2022.
Why?
Because the staff were communicating information to interagency partners as well as social media companies on basic 101 election information, and it was not good use of their time given other priorities that would yield an impact.
All right, my 5 minutes of questioning in the second round has expired. Mr. Ivey, you don't have further questions?
No.
All right, in that case, I thank these witnesses for your valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we would ask the witnesses to respond to those in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Without objection, this committee stands adjourned, subcommittee stands adjourned.